again to Profiles on Nantucket Community Television, Channel 18. I'm Charlie Walters. I have two guests with me today. On your left on the screen is Senator Julian Cyr. Since January of 2017, he's represented the Cape and Islands District in the Massachusetts Senate. And on the right on your screen is Dylan Fernandes. Since January 2017 as well, he's represented the Barnstable, Dukes, and Nantucket District in the Massachusetts House of Representatives. And I should add that it's Dylan's third time on the show and Julian's second time on the show.
Returning guest.
Yes.
Good to be back.
Awesome.
And hopefully many more trips in the future.
That's right.
There are a lot of things we want to talk about today, but let me start with the Student Opportunity Act. And Julian, I'm going to throw that at you.
So K-12 education is, in my opinion, and I think a lot of folks agree, one of the best investments we make in people. And here in Massachusetts, we have a proud tradition of that. This is the state that had the first public education system. Our Constitution actually says that we're required to provide equitable education. And we know, even though we provide significant investments, that not everyone is getting that equal education in Massachusetts. So we have some of our students that have some of the highest, best outcomes of any K through 12 schools in the country. They stack up against other students in the world. But if you look at the achievement gap, it's really persistent in Massachusetts. And so what the legislature has really worked on for many years is to try to figure out how do we really get at that achievement gap. I serve on the Education Committee, and the Education Committee has spent the last 7, 8, 9 months looking at this issue, studying it in detail, and recently we put out a bill that's called the Student Opportunity Act that makes pretty substantial changes to the funding formula that provides resources to municipalities around K-12 education. It's called the Chapter 70 funding formula. It's quite complicated, but what we do in this bill, it's a $1.4 billion investment, additional investment in Chapter 70 resources for K-12 education. If you include what already would increase under inflation, it's a $2.2 billion investment. So this is a substantial chunk of resources. And what we really try to do is target our most neediest students. Those include low-income students. So in the bill, we change how we count low-income students. We raise the threshold from 130% of federal poverty level to 185%. So we're going to be counting more low-income students. And another piece we do in this bill is provide significantly more resources for English language learners, changing the way that we structure those resources. So if you have an English language student who's coming in, say in kindergarten or first grade, we actually know the current funding formula gives you more money for little kids and less money for big kids. It actually takes more resources to educate. If someone's coming in a freshman in high school who doesn't have good English language skills, that's going to take a lot more resources. So we flip the formula there. We provide significant more resources. This is a big deal for Nantucket. 45% of the students in Nantucket Public Schools go home and they're speaking a language other than English. They've seen a 650% increase in ELL needs and services, I think, in the last decade here. We've worked hard, and actually, recently, last time we were on island, we actually sat down and had a meeting with the school committee and Superintendent Kozert to talk about the needs that this island has, and English language costs are a big, big part of that. So this bill is doing that. There's a whole host of other things the bill does. We take a look at rural schools, which we're rural here on Nantucket.
Doesn't always feel like it, but yes, we are.
Exactly. Looking at school transportation costs, a whole host of pieces. It's just a really big deal. The Senate's going to be taking this up, actually. We'll be debating the bill on October 3rd. I expect we'll pass it. We'll send it over to the House. But this is a pretty significant investment, arguably the biggest thing we've done in education since 1993, when there was the last time we did a major ed reform package. Arguably, this could be bigger.
Well, now this $1.4 billion, this is over the next 7 years. Do I have that correct?
That's correct. So over 7 years, increasing those Chapter 70 resources. What we do is we look at, there's something called the foundation budget. So what it costs, what the state estimates it'll cost to educate a student in a given school. And we're, by changing how we count low-income students, English language learners, special education costs, we just haven't been taking those into account in an accurate way. And so by changing this, we're going to then provide more resources and more dollars to communities to help these students. Yes, this is going to benefit especially a lot of gateway cities and other communities where the achievement gap is really high, but for Islanders on Nantucket, it's also going to benefit communities here because we have such a huge need with English language learners.
Well, two words pop out at me: equitable in the first place, and need.
Yep.
I mean, obviously, Boston, the largest city in the Commonwealth, has a lot more students than Nantucket or whatever town you want to talk about. But Nantucket's need, in spite of the fact that this is a very wealthy community, it does have a lot of needs that you wouldn't see in Wellesley, for example,
Yep.
or Williamstown or other wealthier communities in the Commonwealth.
Exactly, Charlie. It's not just size, it's about need. And I think why I'm proud of this bill, and I think we're proud of it and excited to vote on it, is that it's taking into account the needs of communities like Nantucket, the needs of places, elsewhere in my district, the Dennis-Yarmouth district, other school districts that have really kind of not traditionally gotten their fair resources. There's another piece in the bill. There's a commission to actually study how we calculate the municipal contribution into this formula. And this is pretty wonky stuff, but that's important because the formula is largely based on property values. Our property values here and across all the communities we represent are so out of whack and so inconsistent with people's actual earned income. And so we're trying to push through this process to get a more accurate snapshot of what the need is. And this bill is a pretty substantial start, and it's pairing with pretty significant resources, which we'll see those resources here on island, and we'll see them across the Cape and Islands and across the Commonwealth.
Dylan, House Speaker Robert DeLeo has said that no new taxes and no new revenue streams will be needed if this act is enacted. How does that work?
Well, so this year actually, the House Speaker has indicated that we're going to be taking up a revenue package. And so one part of this is that there's the millionaire's tax, which is a 4% increase on the incomes of people who make over $1 million a year. So your first $1 million, you stays the same rate as everyone else. We have a flat income tax in Massachusetts. And then on your millionth and first dollar you're making a year, you get an increase in 4% of your tax rate. And this is a piece of legislation that actually has to go through a constitutional convention because our income tax in Massachusetts is in the Massachusetts Constitution. And so we voted earlier this year for what we call it's called the Fair Share Amendment, and it's that 4% increase on incomes. And that has to go through another legislative session, because in order to amend the Constitution, you have to the bill has to pass through two separate legislative sessions and then go to the voters to vote on it. But this is something that is overwhelmingly supported across Massachusetts. It's overwhelmingly supported in the legislature. And the language of that says that the money raised on this millionaire's tax is going to go towards education and towards infrastructure. So this is something that people are likely familiar with because there was a citizens petition to change the Constitution on it. That was actually ruled unconstitutional because the question, one, raised revenue, and two, allocated that revenue. And the Supreme Judicial Court ruled that for a citizens article, a citizens change to our Constitution, that the question can only be focused on one single issue. But the Supreme Judicial Court ruled that it was focused on two issues, so that means that we had to go back and do it ourselves. And we've already started that process, and so when enacted, that's projected to raise somewhere between $1 and $2 billion a year, which is exactly the cost of this bill. And then on top of that, we're having a revenue discussion this fall, and we'll see how long it takes to play out. But there's a lot of different revenue pieces on the table. One big piece of this is, hey, how do we transition to a clean energy future? A part of the discussions right now is raising the gas tax a little bit to incentivize electric vehicles, slowly wean people off of these cars that are In Massachusetts, our #1 carbon footprint comes from transportation. And so there's a lot of talk about how do we transition to a renewable energy future, which we know we have to do really quickly, or else the world will be a very different, it's already a very different place, will be pretty much unrecognizable by the time our kids are our age. And so there's been a lot of talk about raising revenue through a gas tax, and then there's a bunch of other things that are on the table because we have a lot of things that have gone underfunded in our state for a long time. Education's one of them, transportation's another one, transitioning to a clean energy economy is another piece that requires funding as well.
What I'd add too, in the FY20 budget on education, we're actually already on track to reach these funding levels. So what some naysayers have said we weren't able to do that, we were able to do that in this budget. I think more broadly on revenue, there's kind of that term, this was just sort of a hangover from the 1970s around, Taxachusetts. If you actually look at taxation,
isn't really accurate.
What isn't accurate?
No.
We're 24th in the nation
Antiquated.
for taxation. Yeah. So I think what we're trying to figure out is, all right, if we get especially the most uber wealthy among us, and we have tremendous inequality in our country and in our state because we haven't been doing this, but if we can ask them to pay a little more, if we look for some other creative revenue, we're going to be able to, keep our awesome economy that we have here in Massachusetts broadly, at least in Greater Boston. We've got, more challenges in the extremities, but we'll have more resources for education. We can desperately update, our transportation system, which is pretty woefully inadequate. Really take the steps we need for a clean energy future to combat, climate change and climate disruption. So that's what we're trying to do. And actually, that no new taxes mantra, which hasn't come from the Senate, but sort of has come from the Speaker, he's changed his tune a little on that. So I think you'll see a really thoughtful conversation on it. Certainly it's a complicated conversation, but as you said, that kind of old moniker just no longer is true.
Yeah, and I guess it hasn't been true for some time.
For decades,
but Massachusetts has had this reputation for decades.
And so if you look at, so we have underfunded in Massachusetts a whole host of different programs, and they've been cut for a long time. And the level that they're funded at now is still largely, accounting for inflation, largely below the levels that they were funded at, and the early to mid 2000s, and even late 2000s. And so a part of that is the recession, but an even bigger part of that is when Massachusetts decided to lower its income tax rate through a ballot initiative in the year 2000. And so Massachusetts gets a disproportionate amount of its tax dollars from our state income tax. And then in 2000, we lowered it by over a percentage point. And that lack of that, just 1 percentage point, has led to an underfunding of our schools, our transportation, and a whole host of other great programs that people rely on. And so, and to Julian's point, to your point, in the 80s and the 70s, Massachusetts was a high tax state. Now we're actually in the back half. So we're not looking to totally transform our tax system, but we're looking to make some really meaningful tweaks to allow us to fund these critical programs.
Let me stick with you, Dylan, but on another subject.
Sure.
16-year-old voting.
Yeah.
That'll wake some people up.
Yes.
Talk about
it
that.
Does. It does. It's a fascinating issue to talk about because everyone has opinions on it. I'll start off, last session we passed comprehensive civic education, which is a really big deal. It mandates that in our schools, in our middle school and our high school, that we're teaching civics. There's a component of it that's project-based. And we've seen in our country this really kind of lack of knowledge about what government does and how that has led to a distrust in government. And I can't tell you how many times I've had people, probably Julian too, ask us how is your commute to Washington, D.C.? And then having to explain to them, I'm a state rep, I go by, and they're well, what is a state representative? And then, I think maybe parents could use this mandatory civics education too.
I think a lot of them could.
A lot of people. So we mandated this in schools. It's crazy that it wasn't there in the first place, right? And then building upon that, Andy Vargas, who is another millennial legislator from Haverhill, and I filed a piece of legislation that empowers municipalities to give the right to 16 and 17-year-olds to vote in only municipal elections. So they couldn't vote for me and Julian. They couldn't vote for president because that's a federal election. We actually don't have the authority to allow that. But they can vote for their municipal elections.
In other words, if you were in the town of Nantucket,
That's right.
you'd be able to vote for the select board or whomever.
Yeah.
And
But you couldn't
importantly,
vote
yeah,
for your races
that's right.
or the federal level.
And importantly, right, they'll be voting on school committee members, right? They'd be voting on school budgets. They'd be voting on the issues impacting their towns. And so these are things that they have a massive stake in because they're the ones in the schools. And so this is about, it doesn't mandate that all 16 and 17-year-olds are allowed to vote in Massachusetts, but it says that the local communities, 351 municipalities in the state, can empower students, 16 and 17-year-olds, with the right to vote. And so what we hope, building on this civics education, what we hope is, if passed, this will allow 16 and 17-year-olds to fight for their own right to vote in their local communities. And so it's another way to engage them in the democratic process. And then also, look, they pay you work at 16, right? At least I did. I was
well below.
way before 16.
11 or 12 probably.
Not everybody.
Well, we did.
We did. So,
But a lot of kids,
education, right?
a lot of people pay. A lot of them are paying taxes. And look, we entrust 16 and 17-year-olds to drive 2,000-pound vehicles over 60 miles an hour, right? And so, relative to giving them a license, casting a ballot is totally harmless, especially when you consider it being
Totally harmless?
And I think so. I think so.
I think the other thing
And
that's
16, especially when it's in a
what's
municipal
also
election.
important here is we know that civics, like anything, is a practice, right? And so if you're able to start that practice at a younger age,
That's a good point.
Get
Get them in the habit.
right? Getting in the habit. We actually don't think from actually, if you are, as a young person who was involved, in public life before I could legally vote at 18, I would show up at town meeting. I would go to the school committee, and I was able to speak, as is sort of the tradition here. But I think really kind of building that practice and how civics is a practice. We used to do this quite well in this country. We've gotten away from it, and I think it's a good opportunity to really build that. While these students are still in high school, many people, by the time you're 18, you're off beyond sort of the public K through 12 education system. You're either working, you're in college, you're off doing something else. If we can start teaching that at an earlier age, that's going to be a real value for our civic life.
Would this require a constitutional amendment?
No.
No, really? So theoretically, they could set it to any age they want.
Yep. And we also even allow municipalities currently are able to opt in to allow 16 and 17-year-olds to serve as members on non-regulatory boards, which is something that actually some of the communities I represent on the mainland have already been doing.
Really? Interesting. Let's stick with you, Julian. Talk about housing.
So, housing, aside from the existential and very real threat of climate disruption, housing is the biggest challenge we face on Cape Cod, on Nantucket, on Martha's Vineyard. We have not kept up with the housing that we need in our communities. And largely that's because we have a real estate market that is geared towards second, third, fourth homes. And so this is where we see a whole confluence of challenges that are happening in our communities. The biggest number one issue when I talk to business owners, anywhere in my district, including on Nantucket, workforce housing, right? They can't find workforce, and that's tied to housing. We've got significant challenges from a public health perspective. There are dozens, if not more, of homes that are the 2, 3, 4-bedroom homes where you have over 20 people living in those homes. That's a public health threat and a crisis. So what we've both tried to do, and Dylan will talk about the home rule petition that we're trying to work to advance from Nantucket on the Hill, but to really look at more broadly, there's not a silver bullet. There's not one thing we can do that'll fix this issue. We got to have a myriad of policy issues that are going to make change. And so we've been working with housing advocates, with realtors, developers, the towns, to figure out what those policy levers are. And so I filed a bill, it's called an Act Relative to Attainable Housing in Seasonal Communities. and it identifies 11 policy changes, most of which are actually pretty simple, that would make a big difference here on Nantucket and would make a big difference across the region. One example, for instance, the SHI list, right? This is the list the state has around what qualifies as a, quote, affordable housing unit. Well, Nantucket has this wonderful covenant housing program. It doesn't qualify. It's not counted in that SHI list. We want to see those covenant homes counted because we want to have some sort of incentive for those to be developed. Currently, a school district or a fire district or a municipality really is limited in legally what they can do as far as getting involved in some sort of housing development for, say, municipal employees or for teachers or for firefighters. We build on what California and North Carolina have done to get to do that. Another piece, we know that there are island landlords who are renting out units at a pretty affordable rate for people, and they're trying to keep that.
Within the context of Nantucket.
Within the context of Nantucket, or in my neck of the woods on the Outer Cape, there's a proposal to actually provide a property tax incentive for folks who are renting out property. If you're renting it at an affordable rate, you should get some sort of property tax break. It's probably not going to make up the difference between if you were, renting out that apartment, nightly on Airbnb or weekly with rentals, but some sort of incentive to try to keep what we have. So this bill has had a hearing before the Housing Committee. I'm the vice chair of the Housing Committee on the Senate side, and so we're trying to advance these pretty common sense policy initiatives that would make a real difference for us here in this broader conversation about housing, right? We're not the only place struggling with housing. Essentially, the whole greater Boston area has a housing crisis. In our estimation, a lot of that's due to the fact that we haven't kept up with housing production. There's rampant sort of not in my backyard attitudes in many of our communities, especially in the Boston suburbs, and a real problem with sort of the focus on development has been solely luxury development, right, if you come to Greater Boston.
Well, this is the downside of the fact that everybody wants to live in Massachusetts.
Yeah,
it's great in some ways, but it also causes a lot of problems.
And we haven't kept up.
Now, you mentioned a home rule petition.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about that, Dylan?
Yeah, we'd love to. So Nantucket has, for several years, long before I came into office, has been filing a home rule petition based on the land bank, and I'm sure a lot of viewers are familiar with it, around a percentage fee on high-cost home sales. The latest iteration that we filed is a 0.5% transfer fee on home sales over $2 million. That's the home rule that Nantucket town meeting voters voted on and sent up to the State House. And so I filed it last session as well. We worked really, really hard on it and really fought for it, got it through 2 committees, but it kind of died in the last, at the very end of session. And so as a post-mortem to that and talking with folks at the State House, hey, why didn't this go through? What's the issue? Well, part of the issue is that Nantucket, because it's been such a leader on creative housing initiatives, has communities from all over the state looking to what's being done here and copying it. And so a bunch of other towns had filed similar transfer fee bills. This guy's hometown in Provincetown filed one. Somerville filed one. Brookline is about to file one. Concord filed one, modeled after Nantucket's home rule petition. And so the pushback that I got at the very end was like, look, we don't want to do this piecemeal and have one town have a transfer fee and then have a different transfer fee in this town and this town and this town and have different transfer fees all over the state. And so I packaged, and taking back that feedback, I packaged together a statewide local option transfer fee bill that we filed this session, and then another transfer fee bill got filed by a representative in Boston, and another one got filed by a representative in Cambridge, Somerville. And along with all of these other home rule petitions, they were modeled after Nantucket's. And so looking at that very early in the session, I looked at all these bills, looked at all these different legislators filing these bills, and convened everyone together and said, guys, we all want the same thing here. Let's rally behind a piece of legislation that everyone can support. And so through several different meetings, we've now come up with a piece of legislation that takes a little bit of everyone's bill, It's actually, the base of it is Nantucket's home rule petition bill, and we've worked a kind of statewide version that will that everyone can get behind. And so we have the advocates on Nantucket that have been incredibly supportive of it, but then also we've looped in dozens of different organizations across the state of Massachusetts that are also deeply concerned about the lack of revenue going towards affordable housing. And so we have folks out in the Berkshires, out in Western Mass, partnered with folks on Nantucket and the Cape and Islands, partnered with folks in Boston and Greater Boston, because this is a statewide crisis. It's really a national crisis, but in Massachusetts and right here on Nantucket in particular. And so next week, we actually are convening this coalition again to meet with the chairs of housing and the chairs of revenue, where the bills are relevant to, and the bill is actually in the committee on revenue right now, and a couple of Nantucketers are going to come up. And so we're working to build a coalition to work on a statewide local option piece, and having partners across the state makes it a lot easier to do that.
Now, the word option, I'm assuming that communities that don't have Nantucket's wealth are not going to be tied down to the same percentage, let's say, that Nantucket is. I mean, what works for Nantucket may not work in Chelsea, and what works in Longmeadow may not work in New Bedford. So this isn't a flat across the board.
That's a great question.
Option is there. Right?
So based on a lot of feedback from legislators and groups from across the state, we restructured the bill so that the baseline, so in Nantucket, the threshold is $2 million, right? Pretty high threshold.
Yeah, pretty.
And everyone else, I went to, I had a meeting in Boston, everyone's like, that doesn't apply here, right? And so we give a lot of leeway to local communities. And we say the threshold has to be the state median home price. It has to be above that. It can't be below that. But it's for those 351 cities and towns across the state to decide what works best for them. So if this passes, Nantucket at town meeting will probably raise it back up to that $2 million threshold. And also, we changed the percentage structure. Whereas Nantucket's home rule said 0.5%, we say it can go up to 2% because different towns will want to go up a little bit higher than 0.5%. Sure. And so there's a couple other smaller tweaks, but basically we give a lot of flexibility to cities and towns across the state to decide based on the local needs of that town.
Can they opt out?
Oh yeah. So it's an opt-in. It's an opt-in. So it's not mandatory. I am sure a very small percentage of cities and towns will actually decide to opt in, at least in the beginning. But those towns that will decide to opt in desperately need the revenue. And also,
most of those towns you just mentioned are very wealthy communities.
Yeah. But even in poorer communities, are in a housing crisis. But one thing that I wanted to make sure of is that the communities like Nantucket and the Cape and Islands broadly, and other places in the state that have a real housing crisis. We're at the focal point of a housing crisis. I wanted to make sure that the money that we're raising to address that housing crisis doesn't go back to Boston to be distributed across the state, that it stays in the local communities for local residents to decide how to appropriate it. And so Nantucket especially, there's a lot of talk about, okay, we need more housing here, we need more workforce housing, but we want to do it on our own terms in ways that match our unique local community. And so we have
knowledge about too.
Yeah, exactly.
As opposed to somebody in Boston who's never been to Nantucket.
And so in Nantucket's close to getting its 10% under the SHI list, has a little ways to go, but this would allow Nantucket to get to that 10% on its own terms, and that's a really important thing for this island and a lot of communities across the state.
Julian, talk about mental health in Massachusetts.
So we've been spending a lot of time on this. I was appointed as chair of the Joint Committee on Mental Health, Substance Use and Recovery. I'm the Senate chair. Actually, the day we're taping this, my House chair, Representative Marjorie Decker, is a colleague of Dylan's. She's actually coming over to the island, and we'll be having a conversation around challenges around behavioral health and mental health. Broadly, if you look at Massachusetts and healthcare, we're number one in almost any metric you look at, right? Whether it's health outcomes, we're actually number one on quality, we're number one on cost, which is a big issue. We don't do so well on mental health. And really, we actually don't even have a mental health system. We have component parts of that. If you are someone who is having a real psychiatric need, you are going to, and if you've talked to anyone who's gone through this, and I have people in my life who have, it's very difficult to access care, both the resources that hospitals have, going from an emergency department to an inpatient unit, even just getting that bed, a real lack of a continuum of care of people who are struggling, following the inpatient to outpatient. So we've got this real fragmented system. And what the committee is trying to do is think really thoughtfully about how do we address that. And there's some ways that we know. One is insurance parity. So under state law and federal law, insurance companies must provide parity between medical surgical care and mental behavioral health. We know we're not doing
parity,
that.
what does that
By
mean?
parity, I mean actually spending of dollars and actually provision of care. You've got to provide, if you're someone having a heart attack and all the, or some sort of cardiac arrest and some sort of crisis, the services and care that you receive must be on par, must be parity with if you were having a psychiatric attack or episode. That is not true. We fundamentally know that it's not happening. There's a whole host of barriers that have been that exist around insurance coverage. Most private insurers and actually Mass Health carve out insurance coverage for behavioral health. So if you're on Tufts Health Plan, or Harvard Pilgrim or what have you, or Mass Health, if you're for behavioral health care, you're not picking up the phone and talking to that insurer. You're actually talking to a third party. Often, actually, that's a private company, not a nonprofit. All the insurers in Massachusetts have to be nonprofits. That's not true there. So that's one piece that we're looking at, but a whole host of other challenges from rates. How do we get workforce? So just there isn't. We don't really have a good pipeline of getting people to be social workers, to be community workers in mental health, psychiatrists, psychologists. That pipeline, we don't have that. And particularly that's true here on a place like Nantucket, which is very isolated.
And it gets back to the housing issue.
And it gets back to,
you may have a job here you want, but if you can't afford to live here.
Well, and that's why the hospital's kind of considering they're already into it, but getting more into the housing business. So we're doing a pretty deep dive on this, certainly trying to figure out, and more kind of close to home here on the island, we've been working closely in partnership with a coalition looking at suicide ideation and the suicide contagion that we've seen here, kind of pop up 2 or 3 times in recent years. Another big challenge has been around off-island transportation. So if you're having, again, if you need to, think about if you had a serious cardiac incident or a major accident, right? You're going to go to that gleaming, beautiful hospital here in Nantucket, and then you're going to either get an ambulance or a medevac off-island. If you're having a psychiatric episode, it's really hard. We've actually come up with resources in the state budget to help islanders to get off island for medical care in that case. So we've been trying to focus on that, but really big meaty policy issue. I don't have kind of any updates yet, but when I come back, I hope to be able to talk about some exciting legislation we're going to do on this issue. I think we really have. I really believe we have an obligation to make sure that we care for the whole person. The fact that we sort of the current healthcare system and the insurance structures and all that, sort of care for sort of the neck down in one way, but what's going on in your head, we treat in a very different way. We've got to change that.
Are there states or even other countries that can be used as models for how to deal with some of these issues?
Yes. So there's a lot of exciting models around basic community-based mental health. So how do you get mental health services into the community? Some states have been doing good work on that.
Some medical emergencies on Nantucket require a helicopter.
Yep.
Weather permitting, of course, which is another whole issue. You can't legislate.
No, we can't legislate the weather.
Well, we can actually with climate change, but
Nantucket, being an island, 27 miles off the mainland, this becomes a serious issue. Not that nobody else in the state is being helicoptered, but on Nantucket, you might spend what, 5 figures just on the helicopter?
Yes, and in the instance if you're needing psychiatric treatment, the way you'd get off island would probably be through on an ambulance, not on a not on a helicopter.
But if you had a non-mental health issue, or even if you did have a mental health issue,
Yeah.
At what point does the private and the public, does one step out of the way of the other? Do they work together?
So actually,
I guess I'm talking money here more than anything
well,
else.
with money, it depends on who your insurer is, and whether or not what insurance you have, whether it's private insurance, whether it's public insurance, through Mass Health. Actually, Mass Health benefits around mental health are actually more generous and more supportive than a number of the privates. So it does come down to money, but if you look at the system, we spend, I think it's $68 billion in healthcare here in Massachusetts, right?
And that's out of a total budget of...
So no, I'm talking across, the entire
private,
state.
yeah.
The state
talking
budget's about
private.
$43 billion, and just about 40% of that is Mass Health. If you include other health and human services, it's almost 50%.
By far the biggest chunk.
But, huge chunk. But what we're trying to get at is, look, we've got so much money in this system. This is not about adding more money into the system. This is about redistributing it and really saying, all right, where are we spending so much money in healthcare? How do we redistribute this and really focus on mental health, substance use, other pieces that have really been left behind? And I think part of that's just even a cultural piece. I think there's a stigma to it. You're presenting with a cardiac arrest or you're a diabetic and you have you need insulin or low blood sugar or whatever's going on. We treat that fundamentally differently than if you present with someone who has psychosis, or you are someone who has an addiction and you want treatment and want to detox. In this state, we send people to jail when they are going through what's called a Section 35, right, with their civil commitment. We would never do that. If we didn't have enough cardiac beds, we would never say, oh, hey, well, we're going to send you to this county correctional facility that can take care of you because we just don't have enough beds. That's the situation we're in with mental health. It's unacceptable, and we need to change it.
Well, too many people overlook the fact that the mental and the physical are linked.
One and the same.
You can't separate one from the other.
Precisely.
So there shouldn't be that stigma there for mental illness. Dylan, shellfishing on Nantucket.
Love those shellfish.
So do we.
So we're on our last event of the night is the Scallopers Ball tonight. My favorite island tradition, the most delicious island tradition. So that's a good segue to talk about the amount of funds that we've gotten for shellfishing on island and what we've done to help the shellfishing industry here. So in the past, 2.5 years alone, we've gotten $175,000 just in Nantucket, just for shellfish propagation. And that's a really big piece here in an industry that is a big part of our cultural identity, a big economic driver, but also leads to better outcomes when it comes to water quality and filtering out the nitrogen in our water. And so there's a lot of components to this. One big piece of this is around ocean acidification and the threat that poses to the shellfishing industry in Massachusetts, to marine life broadly, but especially to the shellfishing industry, because as the ocean acidifies, shellfish can't form their shells, they can't calcify. And so Julian and I passed a bill through the House and Senate that became law that creates the first ever ocean acidification legislation in Massachusetts, creates a commission of people in the shellfishing industry, of scientists, of legislators, to take a really hard look at how we can address ocean acidification here in Massachusetts and how we can help our shellfishing industry address it and adapt to it. And we're actually going to be kicking off our first commission meeting later on in the fall. But also, one of the joys of this job is working on big pieces of legislation like the OA stuff, the ocean acidification stuff, but also about just, being responsive to the local community. And so when folks from the Nantucket Shellfishing Association called me last year about the state was closing the season early and they wanted to get it extended. Well, they called me on a Friday, but we got the state back out here on a Monday to come in and test the waters and extend the shellfishing season. So this job is a lot about kind of what we're working on Beacon Hill around big pieces of legislation, but I think one of the most rewarding pieces is just little things like that, helping people out in the local community and getting the state down to help our local shellfishing industry here.
Well said.
Well, for context, in other municipalities in your districts aren't exactly the same. Does Nantucket have the same shellfishing issues that, say, Falmouth has, or pick your community?
Well, yes and no, right? I mean, broadly speaking, yes, but shellfishing is very specific to the very localized ecology where you keep the shellfish, and so just in the town of Falmouth alone, there's Buzzards Bay, there's Martha's Vineyard Sound, there's all these estuaries in between, and so just in that one town, and same here on Nantucket, where you put the shellfish in different waterways, you'll have very different results and very different tasting shellfish, very different size shellfish in that one particular town. So it's a very localized thing.
Broadly, we've seen a real expansion of aquaculture. That's been a real past opportunity. Wellfleet's a community where generates the first or second most amount of shellfish in the state. That's a really big, important economic driver. We've seen a lot of growth in Barnstable as well. What's unique about Nantucket, I think, one, the scallop industry you actually have here, the actual, this environment here is pretty unique in the region. But what's kind of a common thread in all this is in a changing environment, and we're already seeing changes in our oceans and in our waters here, this is really going to impact, a burgeoning industry, and where sort of traditional sort of fishing off on boats has really changed here in a lot of ways, kind of gone away. Aquaculture has been an opportunity for folks to make a life, on the water, and we want to work hard, and that's why I think we're excited about this ocean acidification work to try to get ahead of this so we can understand what's going on, protect the industry that we have, and really make sure that we're good stewards of this resource.
Let's go to a related subject, and I'll just throw this to whichever one of you wants to speak up first. Climate change.
I mean, this is the existential threat to this island and the entire region. I mean, I say this, both facetiously but really honestly. We've got a matter of several hundred years, maybe 1,000 years or so, where we get to enjoy this place before it's consumed by the waters, thanks to our own doing. And Dylan will talk a little bit about what the House has done. I'll talk about what the Senate's considering around climate response. So we got to do two things. One, we've caused so much damage already that we're living in a new world already, and it's only going to change and get worse. So we've got to have resources around climate disruption. The House has passed an initiative that's $1 billion. Governor Baker actually has filed a bill that actually uses that same transfer tax on real estate, but uses that to fund climate. I think we're facing such a big issue on this around climate resiliency. We need so much resources that we need the House's $1 billion proposal and we need the governor's $1 billion proposal. I'd like to see $2 billion for this, and that's what I'm advocating for in the Senate. And then more broadly, we've got to get real serious around putting a price on carbon and getting real about this. I mean, I think we just saw with the climate strikes that we had, Cape Codders Islanders participating this, in this across the region. But I think Greta, Thunberg is right. Shame on us adults for not doing something. We are leaving ourselves and our children and our grandchildren, effectively a ruined world, and we need to move with all haste and all speed, to fix that. And we're trying to do our part in Massachusetts. We need federal partnership here, and that's why, things going on in Washington are so critical. But this is sort of the biggest challenge we've got. And, we've done some good things, but it's not cutting it.
Mm-hmm. So climate change, I think to put this in perspective, climate change is happening at a much faster rate, and its effects are much more nefarious than many people think. And so 4 out of the 5 mass extinctions on this earth have come about through global warming, which has been set off by carbon emissions, by greenhouse gas emissions. The only extinction that didn't cause that was that one involving the asteroid and the dinosaurs, right? Every other one was a global warming event caused by carbon emissions. And while previous events played out over millennia, this global warming event is happening over the course of my and my children's lifetime, which is insane. And so the biggest mass extinction, the most notorious mass extinction, erased 96% of all the species on the planet when global warming reached 4.5 degrees. Right now, if every single nation in the Paris Climate Agreement hits their current goals in the Paris Climate Agreement, we will get to 3.2 degrees of warming by the time I'm a very old man. And at 3.2 degrees of warming, the band around the equator on our Earth becomes completely uninhabitable. And we're up here in Massachusetts are living in heat waves that kill thousands of people a year. We're living in a place where sea levels are quite high. And we're living in a place where deaths due to air quality are through the roof, poor air quality. And so that is if every country hits their Paris Climate Agreement goals. No country is even close to hitting their Paris Climate Agreement goals. And we're on a pace to reaching a catastrophic number in terms of warming within our lifetime. By the way, these degrees numbers, these are in Celsius. We're like the only country in the world not to use Celsius. So when you say 3 degrees of warming, that's actually 6 degrees Fahrenheit. But so this is how we've gotten to a point where by the time my children are in their 60s, we may have effectively destroyed the planet. And so this is catastrophic, and this is a crisis that is a really, really hard problem to solve just because it's so big and all-encompassing. But we're seeing a tick, we're seeing changes around it, we're seeing a younger generation step up and say, look, we didn't create this crisis, but we need to have massive transformation in our society to help solve it. And if we don't, our parents' generation will have effectively given us a planet that's uninhabitable. And so in Massachusetts, one of our biggest pieces that we're pushing is this first in the nation deep water offshore wind farm. Massachusetts, we don't have a lot of renewable resources here in terms of the sun, right? Although today's pretty nice, but it is a cold and cloudy place relative to the rest of the country.
Yes, it is.
But we do have wind. You know that here on Nantucket better than anywhere. And
we have
so
tides.
We have wind, we got tides. Well, tidal is like, honestly, it's like not really a thing.
Not as much as wind.
No, not even close. Not even close. I hope it does become viable, but we know, so wind energy has improved so much in the past 30 years to the point where that Cape Wind project, which is now totally dead, the price point on the offshore wind project, 14 miles south of here, the price point is 75% less than the Cape Wind price point. So not only have the towers become more efficient, the price has dropped way down to become competitive with the price of fossil fuels. And when you take into the account of all the externalities, the negative externalities of fossil fuels, this energy is incredibly cheap. And so we have in Massachusetts enough wind resources, enough offshore, deep water, offshore wind resources to power all of Massachusetts if we want to fully harness it. And this first wind procurement, I think, is the biggest thing that Massachusetts has done maybe since universal health care and gay marriage in terms of tackling a massive issue in front of us, because our first in the nation procurement set off a number of procurements, huge procurements up and down the East Coast that actually put a really meaningful dent in carbon emissions. as of right now, predictably, the Trump administration has decided to hold up this project. It might take until he gets out of office to move it forward, but we're not going to stop pushing for it here in Massachusetts, and nothing short of the stake of our generation and generations after that is at stake because of this.
It's a sobering note to end on, and I can't.
I know. I'm sorry.
I can't
It's
think
great.
I can't think of a more
it's
important one.
overwhelming.
So I'm glad you went on about it.
Yeah. Thanks, Charlie.
Senator Julian Cyr, Representative Dylan Fernandes, thank you for coming in.
Thank you for having us.
And please come back anytime you would like. This is
Absolutely.
always great to have you guys here.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Awesome.
For Profiles, I'm Charlie Walters. Thank you for tuning in, and please tune in again.